Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Humanities Kansas Big Idea Presentation. I'm Freddy Gipp, enrolled member of the Apache Tribe of Oklahoma, Digital Program Manager for Humanities Kansas, and your co-host along with Dr. Valerie Mendoza, Director of the Title III Strengthening Institutions Grant at Washburn University. The Big Idea, which is a monthly online series that highlights fresh thinking on humanities topics through brief essays and online interviews. Last season highlighted Black scholars, emphasizing past and present work and how it has impacted their careers and communities. And for this season, we are transitioning our focus to elevate and explore Indigenous scholarship in Kansas. Today's Big Idea presentation, titled Doing Indigenous Languages, features Dr. Andrew McKenzie, Associate Professor of Linguistics and Affiliate Professor in Indigenous Studies at the University of Kansas. He's a member of the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma, graduated from the University of Oklahoma, where he earned his PhD in linguistics. From the University of Massachusetts. He now lives in Lawrence with his family, and his most recent work, Plains Life of the Kiowa Voices of a Tribe in Transition, is a collection of stories and discussions told in Kiowa that was published last month. Dr. McKenzie, thank you for joining us today. How is everything going?
Hey, wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Great. So before we begin, the format of our discussion is very simple. Dr. Mendoza and I will ask questions relating to your essay, career, and other relatable topics in today's Big Idea. And towards the end of the program or throughout it, we'll allow those in the audience to ask any questions through the webinar Q&A and chat feature. Dr. Mendoza, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Freddie. Good afternoon, Dr. McKenzie. It's great to have you here. I really enjoyed reading your essay and so many questions. But before we start talking about that, can you tell us a little bit about what linguistics is and yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the short answer is linguistics is the science of language. And essentially what we're trying to do as linguists is look at what language is, how people use it, how languages compare to each other, how we come to know languages and as children or as learners later in life. And so there's a lot of aspects of language that tie into social behavior, into cognitive architecture, into simple physiology, and a lot of other aspects of life. And so it also essentially gives us a way of bridging between the sciences and the humanities. So some linguists like to do a lot of experiments in the lab with eye tracking devices or MRIs to look inside people's mouths and things like that. Other people are more on the humanities side, working in the field with communities or looking at texts and trying to extrapolate patterns of use. And then some linguists are more applied and try to carry these findings into directly helping people and communities in different areas, either in language revitalization, speech pathology, second language teaching, and a lot of other domains, and increasingly in computation and artificial intelligence. So, just sort of think of what language is and how much of a facet of our lives it is and what parts of our lives language affects, and linguistics is there. And so it could be a very broad topic, but it all boils down to understanding what language is and what kind of creatures we are for having.
Yeah, that sounds completely fascinating. I want to learn more. Just going off of that, in your essay, you talk about how for you, language is about stories and people and community. So can you give us some examples?
Yeah, so just from that, you can tell I'm less on the experiment side and more on the field and social side. But I also do a lot of linguistic theory. So working with formal mechanisms and putting those together, we get a sense of how the language works as a system, but then we also step away from that a little bit, because when we're thinking of language as a system, we have a tendency to abstract away from the person and just focus on these nuts and bolts. But when we want to get a full picture of how people interact with language and how people are linguistic creatures, then we have to see how we interact with these things. So one of the ways that we do that is with stories, and with spam call, sorry. One of the ways we do that is by looking at stories, and that's especially the case with indigenous cultures, because a lot of linguistic transmission comes through storytelling and through the ways that the conventions that are used for that sort of thing. So for instance, with Kiowas, a lot of lessons get imparted with stories featuring a trickster character named Sende, which Freddy you might be familiar with as well. And stories always start with Sende coming along, and then adventures happen. He tries to trick people, people trick him, or other creatures trick him, and so forth. But there's always some kind of lesson that gets in there as well. And so we can get a sense of a lot of aspects of culture, either as linguists or as Kiowas, from these kinds of stories. And in the recent volume that Freddy mentioned, that we have a couple of stories that involve Sende, and they're interesting because this whole volume essentially kind of traces the transition of Kiowas from the older ways of life on the plains as nomadic, hunter-gatherers and so forth, into the modern era through this period of reservation life, and then boarding schools and modern technology and so forth. And one of the stories involves Sende interacting with a white guy who comes along, who's fancily dressed, and he wants a show, essentially. He sort of wants an Indian show. And so Sende gives him one, but in his own trickster way, he ends up bamboozling this guy. And so having this story, we get this sense of what this change was and how these traditions get adapted for changes in modern life. And looking at how people tell these stories, we also get a sense of how Indian life modernized, essentially, as the old way went away, either by choice or by force. A lot of people still think that Indians disappeared, right? Or that we still live in teepees on reservations and so forth. And people who know actual natives, most of us are just living ordinary lives, for a large part. So we eat the same kinds of foods, we go to the same stores, and we watch the same TV shows and that sort of thing. But there's also this element of this kind of anchor in the old ways that allows us to connect. And these kinds of stories help us, help demonstrate that sort of thing very clearly. And with the Kiowa language itself, we also get this connection that, and a more, I guess you can say, a more traditional method of packaging the information than we might otherwise get just repeating the story in English.
Yeah. Sorry, my dog. The adventures of Zoom. So you begin your big idea by talking about being Indigenous today means having that one foot in the traditional foot world and then one foot in the modern world. And so some stories are one way that happens. Can you explain a little bit more about what other ways you might have been thinking?
So I think just in general, a lot of the older, a lot of the traditions, I guess it's kind of tricky to say. Maybe the way that it's worded makes it sound like the traditions are these one thing and then modern life is this other thing, but they're really kind of blended together because the traditions didn't just stop, right? For instance, with Kiowas, there were a number of dances and things that people stopped doing, but then they started doing new dances and new kinds of songs and that sort of thing. So some of them, or some of the ceremonies were adapted, and sometimes they'll use older songs, for instance, but they also have new songs incorporated, right? For instance, there used to be a number of warrior societies that men would join, and those mostly went away. A couple of them kind of persisted for a while, and then now there's a modern one, the Black Ladies, and it's the same sort of idea that, you know, having this sort of military spirit and the idea of, you know, you step up and defend your people, and that's been modernized in some ways. But then there's also this connection to the past, right? Using very ceremonial teepee that goes, it's very old, and using some songs that are relatively newer, and then some songs that go back to the old days. And so, you know, so even having a foot with those traditions, there's still a modernization in them. But in a broader sense, you know, you also have the modern American life, so to speak, right? You know, working, just say working a job, for instance, using technology, driving on the roads, and, you know, going to football games and that sort of thing. And, you know, those parts of life, you know, they're always there. And so we have sort of these two facets of life. And, you know, as an Indigenous, you know, person, you essentially have this sort of bicultural nature. And sometimes you can do them both at the same time, and sometimes you can't. And so you kind of have a foot in each, as you might say.
Yeah, and I love that explanation, because sometimes we think of, you know, Indigenous peoples, like you said, either as they've disappeared, they no longer exist, or our mind is just, and a lot of this has to do with how we're educated, right? Our mind is just stuck on, you know, the headdress and the teepees, right? That older way, and that it's stagnant, and that they have, you know, there's been no evolution, or, you know,
yeah, like, I mean, nowadays we usually build teepees with canvas, right? Instead of buffalo, right? And we'll haul the poles around with trucks, right? So, you know, there's an adaptation, and I mean, and different tribes, you know, reacted to that sort of modernization in different ways. Kiowas often took to it to the extent that when they saw something that was a good idea, they didn't hesitate generally to adopt it. And if something they didn't want to do, then they would resist that. But for some, you know, some things like, you know, using automobiles, like, sure, yeah, that's fun, we'll do that. You know, or using photography, you know, or taking up you know, different kinds of Western art styles, and you know, but also doing it with a Kiowa sensibility or Kiowa twist. So there's always been this sort of you know, mix, and there's a number of artists who are well known during the New Deal era. They're called the Kiowa Six, and I encourage any of you to check them out and read up about them and check out some of their art. And yeah, essentially they took the art world, you know, by storm, essentially, by doing this sort of mixture of Western and Indigenous art. And you know, they you know, pioneered a lot of techniques that people still use. So and in Oklahoma, there's a number of places where you'll find murals and artwork that they did, and it's just, you know, but that's the kind of idea. It's just, you know, it's not like, yeah, there's this tradition and then you kind of become Indian for a day or something. There's a whole, it's just an extra part of your life. So, but at the same time, it requires attention. It requires, you know, kind of having, you're looking at two things at multitasking. There's the word. There's a lot of cultural multitasking, you can say, and you know, that can be difficult sometimes, but sometimes other times it's, you know, wonderful.
yeah. Well, speaking of taking the world by storm, I am completely fascinated with the story of your great-grandfather, Parker McKenzie. And for those of us who didn't get to read the essay, can you just tell us a little bit about him and how and why he invented, or I don't know if I guess invented is the right word, a way to write Kiowa.
So Parker McKenzie was born in a teepee actually in 1897, and he didn't learn English until he went to school essentially, and even later he always had an accent that was really interesting because it was half of this melodic Kiowa and half down home country Oklahoma, and so it was a really interesting way. And he was fascinated by language, and he was interested in education as well. So a number of Kiowas took to education essentially. So I mentioned like some people thought, well, hey, this is really nice, and Parker was one of them. And you could say he was, I mean, nowadays we'd say he was a big nerd, right? And I mean that in the most positive way you can imagine. Like he was very interested in intellectual affairs. He's very interested in, when you saw something difficult, he was curious about it and tried to figure it out, that sort of thing. And one of those things was with language. And he worked with linguists from the 19-teens into the 30s and 40s, and then again in the 70s until he passed in 1999. And he over the years he developed essentially a linguist's sensibility to structures of Kiowa, figuring out what its syllables were, a lot of its different morphology, or what we say morphology, the inflections and things like that, and figuring out exactly how many tones the language has. So if you're familiar with Chinese, for instance, there's a lot of different lexical tones that differentiate words based on the pitch, and Kiowa has that too, but linguists weren't quite sure how many. The professional linguists weren't quite sure how many tones there actually were, but Parker just worked it out. That's what he did in his spare time. And among other things, he also became a well-known genealogist for the tribe, and people would go to his house to try to find things out. So as for writing system, right, this is another thing that he developed over the years and perfected, and also reflected his sensibilities. It basically started when he was in boarding school in Phoenix, Arizona, and another Kiowa lady caught his eye, and he wanted to communicate with her in class, but he thought, if the teacher catches my notes, we'll get in trouble. But maybe if I wrote them in Kiowa, then the teacher wouldn't be able to just think it was gibberish or something, and the only thing is there's no way to write Kiowa. No one had thought about how to write it. And so he kind of cobbled something together. But the idea took root, and as he was working with linguists, he got into being more exact about it. And over the years, he developed an alphabet. And it's an alphabet that's really intriguing and intricate and kind of ingenious, actually. Multiple academic articles have been written about its complexity and ingenuity, and it reflects a number of automatic elements of Kiowa that don't have to be written as a result. It's exact for all the tone and the different features that the sounds can have, and he also had an interesting way of solving the problem of having more letters than the alphabet has. So, in English, for instance, we have about 43 distinctive sounds in American English, standard American English, and 26 letters in our alphabet, right? And so we have to write a lot of sounds in very weird ways. And anyone, we all know how crazy English spelling can be. And in Kiowa, it was something similar. There were more sounds than there were letters, and a lot of the sounds don't appear in English. Right? So for instance, there's a difference between ball, which means bring, and ball, which means eat, and paw, which is it's like body hair, and all, which is a river or the moon, depending. Right? These are different sounds, but they're all made with the lips. And in English, there's B and P, right? But in Kiowa, there's B, there's this what we call unaspirated P, there's the aspirated P, and then there's the ejective or popped P, right? And the, how do you write all those, right? So in linguistics, we usually add little diacritic marks, like an apostrophe or something like that. And he didn't like that. He thought it looked ugly to add all these things. He wanted to just make it look smooth and pretty. And that was one of his considerations. And so he just employed letters that weren't being used. So for instance, there's no F in Kiowa, there's no F sound. So he used that letter for one of the softer P, so the all. There's no V in Kiowa, so that letter was free. So he used that for the ejective. So you have, so you have this substitution system, but the substitutions weren't accidental. They reflected similarities in sounds because F and V in English are also made with the lips. And so that kind of sensitivity to the physiology of the language, what we call the phonetics, that really just showed up. And like nobody told him any of this, right? He never took a linguistics course in his life or anything like that. He did go to college for a little while until his father passed away and he had to go back and handle the family farm and that sort of thing. But he never lost that love of learning. So he developed this system over the years, and he would write letters in it to people. And the thing is, though, for Kiowas, there's not really a single way to write the language. So we were speaking earlier, and Freddy was talking about his Kiowa name and spelling it out, and the way he was spelling it was a different system because other people also came up with ways of writing Kiowa. And it's a tribe that's never had really a central authority. Like there's been like chiefs and that sort of thing, but you essentially become a chief by doing well, succeeding, and you're a chief until you stop succeeding. Basically, people will follow you until they decide not to. Right? And as a result, there's that sort of spirit of, well, you can do your thing. Maybe we'll follow you, maybe we won't, right? And that's fine. And that works with the language too. So Parker developed a way to write some. Some linguists over the years developed ways of writing it, and some people took that up. Other Kiowas came up with ways of writing it, and they taught that. And so different people have been using different systems to write Kiowa, and you can kind of figure them out one or to the other. More recently, the tribe has started official programs and that sort of thing to revitalize language, and they've adopted Parker's system and the courses that are taught at the University of Oklahoma. So you can take Kiowa there, if anyone's interested in, among some other indigenous languages. So instead of taking Spanish or everyone takes Spanish, right? You can take Kiowa instead. And if you do, they use Parker's system as well. So a lot of people will use Parker's system, but even then there's still that little adaptation. So sometimes people will adapt it so you can type it more easily, or that you can text it or that sort of thing. So I guess so he developed a way to write it, and it's the most intricate way and it's the most accurate way because it has more of the details. But it's just as part of Kiowa culture, it doesn't mean everyone's going to use it, basically. And so, but he still tried to teach it, and every time we would visit, his house, he would teach us some of it just to make sure that some of it got passed on. And my brother sent me a video, an old family video from the 80s. It was a giant camcorder sort of thing, and it's a video of him. He had a chalkboard in his living room. This is kind of
That's awesome.
He was like showing us some Kiowa stuff, and me and my brothers were there, and they were just kind of sitting there, but I was the only one like this, like watching, like, rapt attention, and just like, I didn't realize I was that interested in language back then. But and so you get, so for me, the Parker system comes naturally, essentially. I'm used to that. And but I'm also used to the phonetic alphabet that we use in linguistics. And so again, just kind of I have to figure out both ways. So when I'm making something for linguists, I want to make sure that it has the phonetic transcription. But if I'm making something for Kiowas, then, or for myself even, then it's going to be in Parker's system, either directly or adapted. And so, again, it's just sort of one foot in both directions. But Parker always had that spirit of figuring things out, and it comes out in the way that he developed the system, and he helped linguists. We have a lot of his correspondence in archives. You can see that. I mean, he was really impressive. Just to give two indications. So in 1948, he was working with John Harrington, who was a major linguist, field linguist for the Bureau of Ethnology. He worked with dozens of communities and going all over the place. Fascinating person, kind of a weird person. But in that era, in the 40s, it was rare for linguists to even give credit to their native speaker consultants. They mentioned their name, right? But with Parker, Parker helped him out so much that when they published this monograph of the Kiowa language, that Dr. Harrington made Parker the first author.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
And that's that's how important his efforts were. And then later, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Colorado for his efforts later in life. So so I'm not even the first PhD for Kiowa language work in the family, right? The kinds of things that that he contributed were really immense and monumental.
Yeah, that is.
But we won't. We don't have all day. So
Yeah, definitely. I think with what you were touching base off with the Kiowa language, you're doing a great work. And shout out to Dr. Tony Satok too, who's working on that, because I know she uses your method, or the method from your grandfather, because she came up last month for a morning show that we had, and we interviewed her about her work and everything. So about the Kiowa language and stuff, like what's the state today? I understand there's very methodical efforts amongst, like you said, there's language classes being provided by the University of Oklahoma, tribes, they may be having some classes, but what do you think, what in your opinion, what's the current state, and what's kind of needed to make that push from reclamation to full-on immersion, in your opinion?
So the state would be severely endangered, would be the typical way to put it. Although describing languages as endangered, it's kind of tricky because they're not species. Yeah. And they can be brought back more easily than a species, and some people have done this. But essentially, there are the number of speakers, people who fluently speak the language as a first language, is dwindling. There's a number of elders, depends on how you count them, but it's no more than a few dozen, I would say.
Yeah.
And they're all elderly now, and so like with COVID is always a huge risk. But a lot of them are interested and excited, and it's like with Parker, we saw this with Parker too. Working on the language helps keep them going, right? It's gives people a lot of energy to share this knowledge with people, and there's a few hundred what we would call heritage speakers of the language, and that's a term that's emerged recently in linguistics. Came out of looking at immigrant communities, but it applies for indigenous languages as well. and it kind of describes people who have grown up around the language, don't always speak it or feel comfortable speaking it, but they do understand it. And then when they do speak it, they kind of come to a consensus about how to use it, essentially. So there's a number of people like that, and it's tricky because for linguists, sometimes we want to focus on the first language speakers to get the purest data and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of interest of people working with heritage who have that listening skill, especially now that we have better access to a lot of the old recordings people have made. So again, a lot of Kiowa took to technology. One of the things people did over the years was record a lot of things in Kiowa. There's hundreds of hours of people speaking in Kiowa that have not been transcribed or translated. And so and it was directly made so that younger generations would have this knowledge. So one of the things that we do in groups together with the Kiowa Culture and Language Revitalization Program, so KCLRP, and they meet almost weekly and get together and go through some of these recordings and try to see what's on them and learn from them. And sometimes I'll go to those meetings as well. And with Zoom, we're able to meet, even though we're spread out all over the place, the people from all over the US who are able to attend these meetings because of this technology. Before the future though, one of the things this program is doing as well, thanks to a grant from the ANA, is training a new cadre of teachers in the language. They're also working with the state of Oklahoma to develop a certification for these teachers. And that way they can take this to schools and set up preschools and that sort of thing. Right now they're almost at the stage of being able to try for certification. And then for other aspects, like bringing it beyond that to getting it, people using it and using it constantly and that sort of thing. What it takes is just a lot of effort, basically. A lot of effort. Money helps, especially if you want to develop schools and curricula or technology, but it's really just the effort of doing it. And language is hard. We sometimes try to avoid facing that, but it is a difficult thing. The languages that some of the most complicated things you've ever learned, and you did it before you could even tie your shoes or stand up half the time. So it's tricky, right? It's not something that's easily transmitted, and so it requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of work, and people just have to put it in, really. And that's essentially it. And it's hard, right? Especially when you have a life around you, right? You have a job and you have your kids you have to shuttle around, and you have all these things going on in your life. And even with Parker, for instance, he did a lot more after he retired. Luckily, he lived for 40 years after he retired. But when he was working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the Anadarko Agency, he was working, and so he didn't always have time to be helping out or doing linguistic stuff. And so that's the challenge, I think, is for Kiowa, for any indigenous language. It's just that if you're not in a place where you're just surrounded by it 24/7, then it requires a lot of effort, and it's tough, right? You have to find that effort and push through it, essentially.
Yeah, that is true. My family, we're Kiowa Apache.
Mm,
And so like my grandma, she's the late Millicent Mayahona Tapido. She was Apache. And then my grandpa, Burgess Tapido, he was Kiowa, full fluent, everything. Grew up, fought in the fought in the wars. You know,
yeah.
used the GI Bill to get education at Southwestern Oklahoma. But my mom was telling me that him and Parker were familiar with each other. They knew each other, and so I thought that was always unique. And for me, growing up, I was around Kiowa, not enough. I wish I had that inclination that you had, that click for me to want to take to learn more.
Mhm.
I seen him, during his like kind of towards the end of his his life, towards the very tail end. He was very adamant on working with our nephews, speaking with them in Kiowa, showing them the basic things of food, and would and our nephew Bo, he would be only like 2 or 3, and he'd be speaking back, just little terms and stuff,
Mhm.
and that's where it begins. And you're right, that's where it begins. But the problem is that when COVID hit, we lost him, as opposed to of a lot of other elders that were taken in that swift uh,
Yeah.
year. And that set us back, because that was our go-to. He was our rock. He was our person.
Mhm.
He was very kind of like the patriarch, I guess,
Okay.
in the family. But he would also name us individually, when we were born or when we did something to achieve that name. And his name was Eagle Heart, and I think it was Kuntohi Antan Intan. I can't really pronounce it as well. But mine though, for me, like it's called Lead Horse, and that was through I was named because I was the firstborn grandson. And so that was immediate. And then there's others that were given, like my sister, she's woman from across the water because she was born in Germany. And
Okay.
so it's just different things. And then um, my nephew Bo, his name's Kiko, and it's just because he was just really spunky and really sporadic and funny and everything. But now that he's gone, we lost that. We lost that naming, that initiation, that right, with newer kids. And
Yeah.
so it's unfortunate. And I think about that from that perspective. And so my Indian name is Saint Tompa, which, like I said, is lead horse. And I find it very fitting because I find myself, like you said before, balancing both, traditional and in the modern world, where I'm maintaining, this path, but we're doing things that really haven't been done before. Therefore, we're actually being a lead horse, and so it's kind of a full circle of events, and
Yeah.
it's intriguing, from that perspective, that we are, you and I are basically, prayers from our ancestors that wanted us to do better.
Mm.
And I can guarantee that they're proud, especially with the work that you're doing. But overall, we have a question
Yeah.
from somebody, and so we're gonna follow this. So this is from Joyce Frey. She says, I believe in Africa, where there are a multitude of tribal languages, they all use Swahili in spelling to communicate. Do you foresee a type of universal Native American language being developed for that? Or is that something that goes against individual tribal sovereignty issues? That's an interesting question.
No, that is a good question. Yeah. So, yeah, a good part of Africa, I wouldn't say all of Africa, but a good part of Eastern Africa, especially, people will speak their tribal language, neighboring tribal languages too, but also Swahili. And it's what in linguistics we call this a lingua franca, a language that people can use to communicate when they don't speak the same language, and it's kind of a third language. And in Eastern Africa, Swahili is that language. And in, say in Nigeria, for instance, it's English. And so the question is, would you have that for Indigenous American communities? There actually used to be several of these. In this part of the country, there was what's called Plains Sign Language. So it was actually a signed lingua franca. And so people would say Kiowas wanted to communicate with Crows, and if they didn't speak the language, they could use plain signing, and that worked out really well. And that's also an endangered language. There's still some people who know it, but not very many. Yeah, and then this is something that in the Pacific Northwest, there's what's called Chinook jargon, which actually was used into the early part of the settler era, and there's actually a number of Pacific Northwest slang terms that come from from Chinook jargon. Chinook jargon, get the word right. And then in the Southeast, there was what's called Mobilian jargon, which is the same thing. It's just a lingua franca. It wasn't anyone's language, but people just used it. So if like Creeks were trying to connect with Chickasaws or something like that, then they could use this language instead. In the current, you could say English is that. English is the lingua franca, essentially. Because being in the US, any Native American will be able to speak English, if not other languages as well. So I think for Kiowas, the last monolingual, or at least non-English speaking that I know of, lived into the late 60s, the 1960s. But usually by the 1930s.
What was their name?
Akadonma.
Akadoma? What did that mean?
Akadonma. It was actually Parker's mother, so my great grandmother. Yeah, her name actually, it means that they've been looking for a name. And essentially her parents were, trying to find a name for her. They couldn't, working with elders, they couldn't quite get one that they liked. They were in this teepee, trying to figure it out. And they heard someone passing by say, "Oh, why don't you just call her Akadonma or Akadonma, Akadona?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, we like that." So that's what they called her, Akadona. And usually it got shortened to Akon. So just Akon. And just, they've been looking for a name. And so it's one of those names that reflects a story, but in this case, it's nothing that she did, obviously. And a lot of Kiowa names reflect war deeds and that sort of thing, or our ancestors' war deeds, but this one was peculiar for that. But she refused to go to any schools, and generally only learned enough English to get by in town, to like buy things in town and that sort of thing. But she never really picked it up by choice. She, like I said, some people resisted these different ways, and that was one of the things she resisted. So, yeah, some others lived in, to that era. I know there's a nice recording of a hunting horse, Santoki, who was born in around 1845 and passed away in 1947, I want to say. He lived over 100 years. But towards the end of his life, he made some recordings with the Indians for Indians Hour, which is a broadcast that was made, a radio show out of the University of Oklahoma. And a lot of Kiowas would go onto this show because, it's on the radio. Right? So again, this embrace of technology. And, he was one of the last people who actually was alive from the pre-reservation era. And, but he was still, happy to talk on the radio. And, it's interesting that, I have a paper that's actually kind of coming, it's under review, so it's not published yet. But working with a student, we looked at the different, what we call prosody patterns, the speech intonation patterns of Kiowa speakers. And we compared some of the modern speakers with the speakers like Parker and some of the speakers of his generation from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then we also included hunting horse. who was from 2 generations before that. So he's like 5 or 6 generations ago. And what we found is a complete consistency, that the same patterns that were used with Hunting Horse and Parker and Alma Ehud and all these people, they're used by speakers today, like the speakers who we work with, who are our elders. And so it was nice to see that there was this continuity of language that you could find you, if you found yourself transported back, for instance, you could easily communicate. But for, I guess the question, there's also an element of the question about tribal sovereignty. I don't think that language issues really touch on that so much, except that each tribe can decide which languages it wants to work with or focus on. So if, for instance, they want to set up a program for, I guess in theory, Kiowas could set up a program for learning Cherokee. It would be weird. They would be legally able to do it, but it would, I don't know what the value would be. But as far as a lingua franca goes, I would say English.
That segues really nicely to a question we have in the chat, which is, with the push for digitization and digital platforms, how do we emphasize data sovereignty in relation to our journey to becoming conversational speakers in our Indigenous?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess, data sovereignty, let's see. Oh, it's from Randy. Oh, hi, Randy. He was in one of my courses here. So yeah, this is a really good question about essentially when we have all these digital tools, right? And sometimes we can use them to build, essentially to build our own platforms. And the tricky part is that I guess the tricky part is that the platforms themselves aren't, ours, so to speak. If we use a certain programming language or a certain app that goes through a certain, if we make an app for the iPhone, for instance, that has to be approved by Apple. It has to be submitted and all this stuff. And then once you build the code, then either you keep it for yourself or you make it open source, and then anyone can have it. And so for some communities, that's an issue. Some communities don't want to be sharing their language with everyone.
Yeah.
For Kiowas, we've always been happy to share, maybe more than people want even, I don't know. But a lot of communities don't trust outsiders with their language, you could say it that way. And in that sense, so when you're developing something with this kind of technology, it's hard to keep it to yourself. It's just like with any piece of data, it's easily transferred. It's not like creating a book which stays on tribal territory. That's already, it's a little easier, but it becomes tricky because if you work with a service, they have expectations too. And this is a question that comes up in academia as well. As academics, we have to publish or perish, as they say. We have to share our findings with the world. We can't just figure out things. We have to share them. But if we're working with a community that doesn't want the outside world to share that information, then we have that same kind of issue of how do we disseminate our findings without while respecting the wishes of that community. I think the answer is just that it has to be driven by the communities themselves, and sometimes all it takes is just kind of raising the issue. I think a lot of people outside of Indigenous communities don't realize that that is even a thing. the idea of knowledge that isn't for everyone. And I think, just making people aware of it is already something that allows just kind of like, oh, I didn't realize that this was an issue. And once people know about the issue, I find that they're more sympathetic to it, and it becomes a little bit easier to handle that. But it's tricky. So and I think the question goes on to talking about becoming speakers of languages, right? So these sorts of this technology can be harnessed for people to interact. For instance, if you're building if you want to make a video game where you're interacting with people in the indigenous language, right? If you put it on Steam, right? Can anyone play this game? Can anyone get this game? And is that fine? So there's that tricky balance between making it available for any tribal member and then making it available for everyone, for communities where they're not, they want to make that distinction. I think it's a tricky question. I don't know if it's something that can be answered fully before you get there. Something that you kind of have to see what happens and then figure out the solution.
Yeah, you brought up a good point about like how some knowledge shouldn't be for everyone, because like I think what's going on right now amongst the Lakota language, there's some people, there's two factions that are kind of, one group, they really believe that their language is being exploited. And can you kind of touch base on like kind of cultural language exploitation from what you've kind of learned and studied?
And the Lakota case is peculiar because it's different groups of Lakota, there's a Lakota Language Consortium, I think, and they developed a lot of materials.
Yeah.
But having developed those materials, they have the copyright of the materials themselves. And then the tribe, you can correct me if I got the details wrong, but the tribe has contracts with them to use those materials. And then it gets tricky if you want to use those materials outside of that, or if you want to use different materials. So it's, in that sense, it's not just the language itself that's an issue. It's these materials that people make. Right? If you make a textbook, or if you make recordings, they're under, these are, I guess you could say, creative works that fall under copyright, ordinary copyright law. And there's also the sense that the content in them, right, is, if you feel like that should be available to any tribal member, then it becomes the same issue, but in the other direction, right? Where, it becomes messy. I guess. I don't know if there's really I think that, finding that balance of disseminating and disseminating the right amounts, you could say, is something that's tricky. And once it's made trickier by the fact that if you have a business and you're trying to keep that business going, or at least independently funded, where you don't have to get grants all the time and that sort of thing, then it becomes tricky. Do you share things for free at that point, right? So and then that sounds, then it gets back to what we were talking about, this mixture of traditional sharing methods versus modern, copyrighted business transactions. And that's that it's that mix of these two ways, and depending on which one you prioritize, you might get very different opinions about it. So it can get very tricky, but it's just a reflection of that, how we navigate these dual I guess, this cultural multitasking.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that case up there is really interesting because, there's this group, that were upset with, what Indiana University was doing,
Mm.
because they had a consort, and then it was just, it got interesting. And so I'm not gonna speak on that just because I don't know the full details, and so I don't want to put
Yeah,
it in a
yeah.
position. But
I mean,
I just thought, I got curious because I was like, man, like if that's one instance, if something, and they're bringing it to light, how many throughout the years and decades, have that been going on? And so that was my main question, what makes me curious, especially with like how hard it is for these tribes to kind of even just kind of begin programs. Like I understand my tribe, the Apache tribe, we're just now getting back into it, for the past like about 5 to 10 years,
yeah,
and there's classes available and stuff, and that language is interesting because our tribes, we traveled together, we came from up north, and so um, we got about a couple more minutes, but can you kind of talk about from maybe a story from Parker McKenzie or anything about like just kind of like the origins? My grandpa was really fascinated with Devil's Tower. Always was around that area and stuff. Always wanted to go up there, and visit it. And we have like, and there's like the Kiowa Crow hand game relations that they have. They were just up there recently. Team Oklahoma was, but and those Crows will come down to Carnegie and play.
right.
And so like, but it's that familiarity of that area because I remember there was a book that I read, and I forgot what it was, but it was a detailed account of a young Kiowa boy or somebody of traveling amongst the river, and he remembers like as far being up north as like the Snake River,
Mm,
and it was there all the way going until they signed the Treaty of Medicine Lodge.
right.
And so, can you kind of talk about that before we wrap up, just from your perspective and what you've learned throughout
Yeah.
your,
Let's see.
your
Can I share a screen real quick?
yeah, you should be able to.
Let me see. Yeah, because in this volume, I have a map. And that map,
Oh, this is awesome.
so do you see this map?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yeah, this pretty much sums it up, right? So so you see where we are, where Haskell is, and here's Medicine Lodge. Do you see my cursor? I guess?
Yep.
Yeah, so traditionally, what we can tell from the oral history is that the Kiowas went north. They lived around this area, yeah, around the Yellowstone area. And sometime after 1700, they started drifting eastward. They met up with the Crows. And in the volume that I mentioned, the first story details is Parker recounting what his grandmother Pima, or good eater Pima, told him when he was a boy. So this story goes really far back, and essentially they, Kiowas learned Plains life from the Crow, and worked their way down over the years. Here's Devil's Tower. So I don't know if the Apaches, you have the story. We have the story of the Star Girls, where it's, long story short, the Devil's Tower rose out of the ground to protect some Kiowa children who were being chased by one of them who had turned into a bear. And the shape, the vertical striations on Devil's Tower are essentially the claw marks from the bear trying to get to it. And going down, they went down, mentioned in very obliquely by Lewis and Clark as living around the Platte River. But by the early 1800s, they're in the area that they're known to be at. We know that from linguistic evidence that Kiowa is linguistically related to the languages spoken by Pueblo peoples like Taos and Picuris and so forth in New Mexico. So presumably Kiowas used to live in this area a long, long time ago. We don't know exactly when. And then, so we have this oral history that takes us back, and then a long way. And there's also a little bit of linguistic, what we call historical linguistics or reconstruction, where we can use the way, we can figure out how languages are related to each other and extrapolate historical migration patterns from that. And so we can get a nice sense of what Kiowa migration patterns were historically. And then it came to the area that they're known for now in the Western Plains, the Southern Plains, and then the reservation area. Let's see. Stop share. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, there's this. There's a lot of this migration, interactions with different tribes. Some of them friendlier than others, and we learned a lot from the Crow. We learned a lot of traditional religion from the Crow, although there are hints of Southwestern religion in Old Kiowa religion as well. And and those relations stuck for a long time, and so even today, like as you mentioned, there's an affinity with the Crow, and less with like the Lakota and other Sioux tribes who kind of pushed, and the Cheyennes who pushed Kiowas further south. And all this time there was just a band of Apaches who were with us.
That was me.
Yeah, I actually don't know much about how the Apaches came to be with the Kiowas. All the stories I know, they were just there. No, you guys were just around.
You just got captured or followed whoever was.
Yeah, it was really interesting. You might see this band listed as Kiowa Apache because they lived around the Kiowa. But I think Plains Apache is another term that's often known. It's just an interesting group, that just kind of shows the sort of multinational life, you could say, that people had. It wasn't just people hanging out in their own tribe. There was a lot of interaction with other tribes, a lot of trade, a lot of intermarriage, going around, what we would call studying abroad nowadays, right? You go off for a while, you hang out for a couple of years and you come back. You might join a raiding party with the Comanches and that sort of thing. And if you didn't speak the same language, you'd use Plains sign language and you'd work it out. And otherwise, people would learn each other's languages too. So there was a lot of interesting, community and mixture and just kind of living together, right? These sorts of things we see nowadays, like in Europe. They took down their border controls so people could travel from one place to another, and people are learning languages and interacting with each other and spending holidays together, and that's what we had on the plains, and so and it worked out. So
I think that's funny. You touch base on the relationships. I have two cousins that are half Kiowa and half Crow. So that's a real-time example of that relationship still keeping as it is, and they live in Montana, but they come back to Lawrence here and there. But hey, so that kind of wraps up our conversation. Dr. Mendoza, do you have any last words that you want to say to
just thank you so much for this discussion. It's been really enlightening and fascinating. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, and I'm always happy to share my knowledge.
Yeah, so as we conclude with another season of The Big Idea, we would like to extend our sincerest appreciation to Dr. Andrew McKenzie and those in the audience today for the season finale of The Big Idea discussion titled Doing Indigenous Languages. My name is Freddy